This is the Cycling Over 60 podcast, Season 3, Episode 2, Chicagoans Who Bike. And I'm your host, Tom Butler. Welcome back to the podcast, and thanks for tuning in. Before I get into this week's conversation, here's a brief update on my journey. Last week, I shared I was going on a backpacking trip for the first time in 30 years. It was understandable that I got a couple of questions about the wisdom of attempting a hike, coming off the problem I talked about with my knees. I did make sure that I could bail on the trip if I experienced any pain with my knees, so I feel like I was being responsible. Fortunately, I didn't have any pain at all. For me, the most rewarding part of the trip was that while I was the oldest person on the trip, I had no problem handling the challenge. Granted, it wasn't a big challenge, but we did gain 900 feet over a mile as part of the hike. I was so happy that I didn't struggle even though I had about 30 pounds on my back. To me, this was a huge testament to what cycling has done for me over the last 2 years. First of all, the 30 pounds of the pack is less than the amount of weight I have lost in 2 years. And secondly, my legs felt really strong. In fact, I had to slow down at one point on the way back out so that I was moving at a pace that worked for others. That was just fantastic. The fact that I felt absolutely no pain on the backpacking trip has led me to conclude that the knee pain that I experienced on my attempt to ride across Washington was bursitis. I experienced bursitis in my left knee before, and while the pain was intense for a couple days, it went away quickly and didn't come back. That is what I'm experiencing now, in my opinion. I've been nervous about getting back on the bike, but I spent a few days on the exercise bike without any pain. Yesterday, I did go for a short ride, and again, I had no residual pain. Based on that, I'm going to steadily ramp up to longer and more difficult rides. I'm also going to go back to physical therapy and talk about bursitis. I thought after my last bike fitting, I was done with bursitis, but I guess I need to revisit the issue. The next challenge I have is the 52 miles and 2,900 feet of elevation of the Kitsap Color Classic coming up in just over a week. Last year when we did the ride, we got to the finish as they were starting to pack up. In fact, there's a hilarious picture in front of a half-deflated finish line arch that Cascade Bicycle Club staff were holding up for us. So this year I will be working hard to finish much faster. One thing on my side is that I wasn't on the Roubaix last year. Judson, a longtime listener of the podcast, sent me some suggestions for rides in the Pacific Northwest for Season 3. Last week I mentioned that I have a goal for this season to do 7 organized rides. I want 3 of them to be outside of Washington State. That way I'm expanding my cycling horizons. After getting some encouragement from a listener, I'm pretty set on doing the Tour de Victoria, so that is one of the 3 not in Washington. And I'm looking at one of the suggestions from Judson. He shared from the book 50 Rides Before You Die. Now, I couldn't find that book anywhere, so Judson, you will have to put a post in the Cycling Over 60 Strava Club to verify the book's title and author. By the way, our Strava Club is a great place to interact, and it is continuing to grow. In the book, there is a section on the Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho. It seems awesome. It also sounded very challenging. But it looks like there is a bike tour company called Escape Adventures that does a 5-day trip that includes the Sawtooth Mountains. On the trip, you cover 265 miles and 8,000 feet of elevation. On TripAdvisor, the tour has 5 out of 5 stars with 673 reviews. That seems pretty good to me. So that trip is on my list of things I want to do. But I need a bit more information to move it to the I am definitely doing it list. I'm finding it pretty easy to identify awesome rides, and I'm happy about that. I don't think it will be too long before I have a full itinerary for this season. Some of the most fun and interesting times for me are when I get a chance to just be at a trail asking people to share their cycling experiences. Last week, I stumbled onto a project that is all about sharing the stories of people who use their bike for transportation. The project is called Chicagoans Who Bike, and it is the work of Viktor Köves. I reached out to Viktor to get a behind-the-scene view of the project, and he agreed to join me on the podcast. Here is our discussion. I think creativity is the most important aspect of being human. And today I am fortunate to be joined by a very creative person. Thank you, Viktor Köves, for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Viktor is the creative mind behind Chicagoans Who Bike. You can find the project at chaiwho.bike or CHIWHO.bike. I'll put that link in the show notes. Before we get talking about that project, can you talk about your earliest memories of the bicycle?
So my mother was big into biking. So I think even before I learned to ride as a teenager. She was always biking around Chicago. So that was like my association was I always had this image of her like biking around the city. And the first time I rode a bike was probably like early teens, maybe like when I was 12 or 13, and learning in Chicago. So just I always associate biking to me. It's always like been in the city, and I have fond association of getting around Chicago on a bike.
That's cool. I love to hear like when parents just kind of bring their kids along and cycling becomes part of just the family dynamic. If you go to the project website, you'll find a lot of pictures and you'll find comments from people. And I just really was intrigued by it and somewhat jealous by it. It's like, I don't know if you'll get transplanted to different cities at the end of this project and start over, but it's really cool, to get people's own comments and get a wide perspective on people who are on bikes in Chicago. I'm wondering what inspired you to create Chicagoans Who Bike. And you talked about your early connection to cycling in Chicago, but what's your connection now to cycling in Chicago?
Yeah, I mean, I think the inspiration for me, I like to joke that it was such a good idea that I assumed someone had already done it, which is I bike around the city a lot. It's probably my primary mode of transportation. Chicago is, very dense, and I'm kind of on the north side in the Lincoln Square area where really like within a 15-minute bike ride, I can probably access like 10 different coffee shops, 10 different bars. Just like it's a very easy area to bike where I'm at. But Chicago in general is a pretty good biking city. It's flat. And what inspired me is I would just go around the city and I would always see people on bikes who were really interesting. So sometimes it was like I stopped at a light once. I saw someone in an Urban Arrow, which is like a big bucket bike, and it was just two adults in an Urban Arrow. It was like a guy kind of driving the Urban Arrow and a girl in the front. I was taking their picture and she just kind of smiled and waved. And there's just kind of this beautiful mutual understanding of like you see someone on a strange bicycle and you see them and they see you, and there's this moment of like, you're like, that's cool. And they know that that's what you're thinking. Um, and I thought like surely someone like does that and is like talking to bicyclists and talking about their experiences and the wide variety of people who are out there. But I didn't really see that. And there's a lot of great local journalism in Chicago. We're lucky to have Streets Blog Chicago, which does a lot of coverage of bike projects, bike advocacy, just really a rich media ecosystem. But I didn't see that kind of coverage. And so I was like, you know what? I wanted to get a camera for a while, and this is kind of a good excuse. Let me just try this and kind of just see what happens. And I remember the first photos I did, and I just recorded them on my phone. Like I would just talk to someone, record it on my phone, and take a picture with my camera. And when I would write it down and cut it down, I was like, this is amazing. Like I would just talk to random people. I literally just approached a dad in a park once with his daughter and their turn bike. And he just had so many thoughtful and beautiful things to say. And I was like, I think there's some there. And, when I put it out there, just there was a really positive response from the biking community here in Chicago. And it's just slowly grown, building over time. But that's really what inspired me. Um, and as for my personal connection to bike in Chicago, I have three bikes right now. It really is my primary means of transportation. I don't own a car. And I know that's not an option for everybody, but in my community, like it is really eminently doable. And it's something I really enjoy. Like I love biking around. I love seeing everything by bike. I'm a big foodie. So there's just something that really connects with me in biking around my city and getting to experience it.
Well, it's interesting to me. It doesn't sound like you have done a lot of photography projects before this. Is that correct?
That's correct. I've done absolutely zero photography projects before this.
Okay. But you are a creative person. And I know that, yeah, I think you're a coder. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. Software development is my day job.
So, that's obviously creative in itself. But I, when I look at the photographs, I really like the composition. Not that I'm a great photography critic, but I really was drawn in by the photos. So good for you. I think maybe there's just a knack there or an eye there because I think it's fantastic.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I will say, I think I've dabbled in photography on and off. So I used to have, there was a term for it, like a point and zoom camera. So it didn't have interchangeable lenses, but it had longer zoom. And I always loved doing nature photography, birds and stuff. But I think this was my first time getting like a real, like a serious camera with lenses and learning about all of that. And it was like really a learning experience. And I can tell you that there's some of my initial photos like don't look quite as good because there's like a lens I switched to that was like, okay, this is the lens I need for portrait work. So I think it's really grown and developed. And I think I can critique my own shots and see the things that like there's like I can remember the first shot I took where it's like, okay, this looks really good. This is like what I want it to look like. And there's some of the early ones where now I look at it, I'm like, oh, I could have done so much better. So I appreciate it. I think it's definitely, I've been doing it for a year now. I just published interview number 60. And every time I'm publishing maybe one or two photos, I've taken 100 or 200. So I have a wide selection of mistakes to choose from to find the one good shot.
What did you hope to achieve by this project? And did it evolve over time, or do you feel like what you first set out to achieve is the same thing as now?
Yeah, I think my vision and my goal has always been the same, and it has been improving my work and the content that I create in service of that goal. So to step back, I think there are a few different goals, but I think one of the things is I like to tell people that people who bike, particularly, and I say people who bike, I will say in travel, right? So people who bike around their city. And I say that because there's kind of a meme in the bike community that there's the avid cyclist who's like against bike lanes and is like, bike lanes are silly, I'm fine. And what that really means is they like racing and they hit the trail. Most people who are going to the grocery store really would like infrastructure, and there's like a commonality there. In a similar way, I find that if you're someone who bikes Chicago, you understand intuitively that, for example, biking is not a rich person thing, which somehow in certain circles is a common misconception. I talk about biking or biking with kids or e-bikes or any of that, and people are like, oh, that's for rich people. But I know from my own experience, that's not the case. And similarly, like the diversity of people who bike, like just the economic diversity, the age diversity, gender, race, like on every category, there are people who bike who look like you. I guarantee it. There may not be as many as a certain group, but there are people out there. And so my vision was kind of first to challenge people who didn't bike to see people who bike as just like them. You know, it's just a dad getting his kids to school, just like you are in your car. It's not some radical dude. A lot of people I interview actually have a car, right? And they're just like, yeah, I have a car. If I'm going to Wisconsin, I take the car. But if I'm going to my kid's middle school 3 miles away, I take the bike. So I think trying to reach people and say, like, there are people like you and they're out on their bike and they deserve protection, they deserve safety, but also to show the common threads of what people are concerned about, what people are thinking about in the biking community, and to really show that to people in power, hopefully, right? And show them, like, hey, if I've talked to 60 people and 56 of them mention safety, that's an issue, right? That's a big problem. So I think that's kind of the dual goals is like show the diversity of people who bike around Chicago, and I think bike more generally, and also show their concerns, like really like give people a voice in a way that I like to say there's so much car content in America. There's just ambient car culture. It's like the Super Bowl ads, but it's also the YouTube channels, the podcasts, the Instagram reels, like if you're a young person on Instagram, you probably see the like walk up shot where they walk up to a nice car and they're like, oh my God, that's a nice car. What do you do? And so I like to joke too that I'm trying to do marketing for the bicycle. I'm trying to put out there that like there are cool people out there who you should look up to, who are out there biking, who are living a fantastic, amazing life. And I think that's like I'm trying to fill a void there where there isn't really as much content compared to cars.
Well, I think it's an awesome goal. I would like everyone that drives a car that interacts with a bicycle to see that content and to go in and read the quotes and to see the humans that are under the bike helmets or on the bike saddle, whatever, so that as they're passing them, you know, they're thinking about that. But I'm curious, like, who is the target audience? Have you found in comments that people have made who've seen it, or do you have a feel of who how the audience has developed?
Yeah, I think, and this is challenging for a lot of content like mine. I know it's an issue for a lot of bike advocacy groups. My target audience is people who do not bike, right? Maybe it's people who are nervous to bike in Chicago. Maybe it's people who never have, never will, whatever the case may be. It's people who I think like haven't heard this type of message before. I think what I know and what I recognize that there's a natural draw of if you're a biker, there's a catharsis that comes out of reading some of these stories. There's like I think a lot of people in the bike community appreciate the interviews that I put out because they often feel themselves in those stories, right? They finally hear someone say, like, yes, like I've been intimidated by a driver, or like I had this scary like road condition, or whatever it may be, to feel like seen. So I think the challenge there is I don't think those are the people who need to hear my message necessarily, right? I don't think the person, who is also impacted by road rage is the one who needs to read that story. It's someone who maybe has done that before that needs to read that story and see how that impacts someone and how it stays with them. But I'm kind of okay with that. I think there's a beauty in that catharsis that provides, but I'm always encouraging people in all of my calls to action. I try and say, like, send this to someone who's not biking. Send this to someone in your life who drives around Chicago, or send it to someone who's considering biking. So a lot of times I ask people, like, what tips would you have for someone who's scared to start biking Chicago? And I have some great reels that are just like people explaining, like, okay, start slow, like here's how you do it. So I'm trying to reach people who are maybe on the fence and are in that persuadable camp to maybe just try biking and try it for a few trips. Or if they're, for whatever reason, they have to drive everywhere, to just at least see and understand that people biking are just people and they're just living their lives. They're not trying to get in your way. And to see like how big that power difference can be when you're driving a big car versus a bike.
You mentioned that started out with you just noticing people and going up and talking to them. Is that still kind of your subject selection methodology, or do you have more of a process?
Yeah. So I was originally inspired by Humans of New York, which is a pretty popular like photo blog. And to the best of my understanding, he approaches people on the street. And I think that was the vision I had in my head. But the thing is, as my work has evolved, the time constraint, the amount of time I need from people is not really compatible with just approaching people on the street. But also there's just a level of like time commitment of just being out on the street. Like this is not my day job, that's not really as efficient as I kind of would need it to be. So these days, I'm fortunate enough to have an interview intake form and people reach out to me. And every single social media platform, I plug that intake form. I make really clear, like, these are the criteria to apply, which is basically you live in Chicago city limits, you bike for travel. And then people come to me and I think I generally I've been at a good rate of the amount of interview requests I'm getting is matching my cadence. So I generally, I think, have basically talked to everyone who's asked to talk to me, just usually several months later. And then I try and just make sure that I balance out the diversity of people I'm publishing in kind of sequential order, if that makes sense. So if one month I'm talking to only people from the north side of the city, I'm not going to publish all of those interviews in sequence. I'm going to spread them out with interviews from other parts of the city to make sure that I try and keep it as balanced as I can, which is a tricky little thing. But in general, I think I talk to anyone who wants to talk to me.
I think it's great that people are recognizing the value of the project and reaching out. I think that says that you're achieving the goals that you set out because people, want to be featured. They want to tell their story. So that's awesome.
Yeah, well, it's a big honor, and I think it is. Most of the people, when I tell them their interviews live, that's what they say is like, thank you for letting me tell my story. Because I think there is something to that people just want to be heard. I think that's just a universal need people have. But I think, biking in particular, there's like in your community, you feel heard. You understand that someone else on a bike understands you. But to have that broadcast a little broader out, I think really it's that similar catharsis for people feeling like, okay, like this is out there.
I want to talk a bit about photography. And, I'm interested in you talking about, do you have concepts now? You talked about that when you look at it and you kind of evaluate yourself, you see, okay, I wish I would have done that differently. And learning and improving. I'm wondering if you have a concept now, if you could capture kind of the concept now when you're behind the camera and what you're trying to capture in the photo.
I think there's a few things. The main one is I think I published this, maybe in some of the earlier posts, or maybe I mentioned this on and off, but something that people might not know is everyone chooses their own location, with a few exceptions where I was like stationed at a bike shop and I interviewed people there. I ask people to tell me like, what is a place that means something to you? Whether it's about your biking journey, whether it's just in your life in general. But when people are posed somewhere, it's sometimes I think people are like, oh, wow, that's like a really cool setting. That's a really cool combo, or like their outfit matches. I'm like, that was all of them. And I think that's really magical and really special. I think otherwise, it's just making sure that people's humanity really comes through. So there are a few shots where, people prefer to have a helmet on. And this was something I played with. Like there were a few people, there was like a dad in my area who was like, I want mine with my helmet on because I always wear my helmet. I don't want people to get the wrong message. And I took a few shots. I looked at my camera. I was like, that's not working. Like there's shadow on your face. You can't see, like, it's like you're obstructed, right? You're closed off because a helmet is meant to protect you, but it's also like, this is going to sound a little philosophical, but when you're wearing your helmet, it's also kind of closing you off emotionally and you can't connect with someone as deeply. So every time I'd have someone take that helmet off, and I was like, yes, like this is, I can see you and you can see me, and we're like locked in a little bit more. I think otherwise it's just, trying to get the lighting right, making sure that people's faces are good, and I try and do close-ups. So I try and do one wide shot that's them and their bike, and I try and do a close-up, really bring you in and make you feel a little more intimate with that person. Because I think that's the duality. Is some bikes are huge, and I do not try and capture the whole bike. I like there's some very long bikes, and it's just not practical. But I always want to make sure that you see someone's face and you connect with them. I think that's the biggest goal. So like making sure the location is a spot they picked, so like they're there for a reason. There's something there, and you understand a bit more about that person based on the fact that they went with their bike, their outfit to this spot, and they said, "This is where I want to be." And yeah, I think just trying to be true to those dreams and those visions is, I think, really important to me. So I try and capture people as they are. I don't use any lighting, I don't use any reflectors, and I'm sure that could elevate my shots in some way, but I try and make it just kind of like they're here in a spot that they often frequent and just as they are with their bike.
It is interesting that there is kind of two subjects to the photos. There's the person or the people, and then there's also the bike. It sounds like you're prioritizing the person over the bike. I think that's a great decision. But at the same time, it is fun to see the bike in the shot with the person as well.
Absolutely. Well, and I think that's something I realized too. So I try my best to always remember to have a person step in front of their bike, but some of the shots that alternates, I think there's some, pros and cons and some dynamism there. But even there's something I noticed of like, there was one shot where it was a family and they had two bikes and I had them lined up a certain way and the sizing ended up a little strange, and playing with perspective in that way. But I always like, my goal is you are a person who bikes. So the name of the project is not Chicago Cyclists or anything like that, because I want to avoid the baggage with any of those terms. It's just people. It's just people who bike. That's it. Whether they call themselves a cyclist or not is not my business. Doesn't matter. The point is they're out here on our streets biking. And so it's really like trying to frame the person, and the bike is their tool, right? And it's a tool they often love. It's a tool that some of these bikes are custom built and they spent hundreds of hours on. Sometimes they don't care. It's a beater. They bought it 20 years ago, and if it runs, it works. But I always try and prioritize the person first and let them show themselves.
I want to pull up a few photographs here that kind of caught my eye. If you'd talk a little bit about them. The first one is number 8. It seems like there's a decision made here that their name is not front and center on
Mhm.
this. Can you talk about that first?
Well, so I'll say actually, I don't publish names, period. So people may choose to associate them with themselves with their interviews. So oftentimes someone might, retweet it under their own account or comment on Instagram and be like, thank you for talking to me. But I think this was pretty inspired by Humans of New York. I try and keep it anonymous. So it's more like trying to connect you to their story. And it's not necessarily like photojournalism, like this is John Doe on this corner. This is his view. It's a little more abstract in that. So that's kind of a choice I made early on. But yeah, this is a good friend of mine now. I'm like, he's associated himself with it, but this is my friend Rick. He's a big bike advocate. He does a lot of amazing bike advocacy work, and he has this beautiful dragon fruit turn GSD, and that bike has seen more wear and tear than any GSD. He has put like logs and like that thing has probably carried 500 pounds. And so he was one of my natural, like, this was someone I knew I had to talk to because he's just out there. He does a lot of outreach too that I don't think we talked about in his interview, where he like feeds the homeless and will bring like hundreds of burritos on his bike. So it was a really cool person to talk to. And I love taking that photo. And he was a natural behind the camera too, as you can kind of see.
Well, this photo is a little bit different because he's on the bike and
Hmm.
he's not riding the bike, but he's like placing himself on a bike. It looks like he could be sitting there for the afternoon just chatting people,
Yeah.
sitting on this bike, very relaxed.
Yeah.
Was that a conscious decision to capture him that way?
I told him to do whatever he was most comfortable with, and he tried a few different poses for me. And I think some people are a little more camera shy and I have to give them a little more direction. I'm like, okay, relax. Like, you have to coach them a little bit more. He was like a natural. Like he gave me like 20 great shots. Like he was just very comfortable. And I think that just reflects of like he's really outgoing person. He does a lot of like social events like this. This is his like daily workhorse. Like he has put thousands of miles on that machine. And I think that actually captures his attitude really, really beautifully and really well.
The other thing about this photo is it's got Lake Michigan in the background
Hmm.
and it looks very coastal. And I think that that is kind of an aspect that maybe people don't think a lot about when they think about Chicago is there's this coastline that you can cycle along.
Oh yeah, yeah. I don't know if you've had the pleasure to visit Chicago and bike our lakefront trail, but the lake is actually something that comes up a lot to the degree that it's been a little bit challenging because a lot of people want their photos with the lake. But Chicago has this lakefront trail. I think it's like 20 or 30 miles north and south on the lake. So if you are going north or south and you're pretty on the eastern part of the city, the lakefront is this really natural, like kind of a bike highway, for lack of a better term, because it's a fully, you know, off the road trail. And it's just like people use it, like it'll take you downtown. People use it commuting. It's very busy during commuter traffic. Tourists use it to get like a view of the city and get beautiful photos. So the lake is really a central nexus for biking in Chicago in a way that I think is really beautiful and really cool. I think as bikers, that we kind of end up drawn to the water in Chicago in a way that I think is really unique to both our geography and also our bike infrastructure. That this is like, that is probably the longest north-south fully protected. Actually, I'm certainly saying that. That's the fully protected north-south longest trail. So it's just a central thoroughfare for people.
Well, on my list of things to do is bike the drive. So I do want to experience that someday.
It's a beautiful time. I would highly recommend it. Anyone considering it, Bike to Drive is one of the coolest times you can be in Chicago. So I'd highly recommend it.
The next one that I'd like you to talk about is number 15. To me, just thought this was such a great representation of what you talked about earlier, is that this person, I'm guessing, probably would not identify herself as a cyclist, you know, and that bike looks very functional. It's a cargo bike with a couple kids in seats, and I think I see a drum
Hmm.
in that, and it's such a cool shot, and this story of where are you going with the drum and everything. And can you talk a bit about that photo?
Yeah, this is a mom who lives in the Hyde Park neighborhood of Chicago, which, for those not from Chicago, it's Obama's home neighborhood. It's on like the south side, like kind of in the middle near U Chicago. And yeah, this is an urban aero bike for anyone who knows their cargo bikes. It's a great kind of bucket style e-bike. And yeah, she's just a mom who likes hauling her kids around in her urban aero. And I think you're right. I think it's like you can see she's very practically dressed, like wearing like I guess I would say like a sweater, cardigan looking sweater, and like a skirt and boots. And it was published in November, probably shot around the same time, maybe in October. So it was, a little chilly, but you can still get out there and bike and you can still do it with kids. And yeah, they were just having a great old time. I think they had come from some different activity or event because they had like some signs or something, I think, too, and their drum. And yeah, she really loved that bike. And I think the practicality of it, like you said, like especially with kids, you're juggling snacks, water, and I think she talked about like just the benefit of that. So reading from that they're super cozy, they can have their toys and their blanket. She can haul a lot of stuff. So she was a big fan of that bike. And I think that's what I want to show people is like, you do not have to stop biking because you have kids. You might just need a different bike. You might need a bike that can accommodate that lifestyle. But there's people out there doing it and they're having a great time and their kids are happier for it too. So it was a great shot and really pleasure to talk to her.
And one of the kids rocking a unicorn helmet too, so that's
Yes.
that's fantastic.
Yeah, I love you can see their person. I think the boy is a little too, he probably didn't pick his helmet. Maybe he did, but I think he's a little too young. But I know that girl most certainly picked her helmet. And the one thing I'll say too, to add a little context, you can probably see there's like three bikes in the background. And this was at the start of Chicago's critical mass. It was a little bit before it. So she was actually coming out to that event. So she was coming out to this kind of like bike party, bike jam kind of event that happens monthly in Chicago's downtown and kind of goes around. So it's kind of a little Easter egg there that I think people in the bike community will have a feeling, be like, I think I know why they're there.
And then the last one is number 48.
Mm.
Now, this is a bike that is a different kind of machine than the mom taking her bikes to activities machine. Clipless pedals, shoes with cleats, everything. Can you talk a bit about this photo?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll use this man's name because he has it on his jersey, so it's right there front and center. This is Mr. Bobby Berry, just an amazing figure. So he is on this photo was taken at the Major Taylor Trail, which is like a South Side trail. I think this was at I want to say 111th on the Major Taylor Trail, where there's this beautiful mural behind him. And he is really just a steward of this trail. So there's a board that meets for this trail and does projects around it, activities, all that sort of stuff. So he's very influential in that community. So you might think, looking at this bike, like this is a guy who like races all the time. He's a triathlete. I think I actually asked him. I don't know if I got into the interview, but I don't think he actually races. He just like loves bikes and tinkering with them. I think he has a bunch of them. And this whole bike is like custom and he did a bunch of stuff to it. But he just loves hitting the trail and lives right off this beautiful trail and likes to ride it up and down. And really is just like a community figure. Like he is just always out there. And when I published him, people recognized him because he's just a guy who's out there. And also I'll say, I'd encourage people to read it. Interview number 48, like you said, it's a really moving story. So unfortunately, as we were booking the interview, he had to reschedule And the first time he rescheduled, it was because his wife was in the hospital. And the second time he rescheduled was because his wife had passed. I was like, you don't have to talk to me. Like, do whatever you want to do. And he said, no, I still want to do this interview. This is really important to me. And I feel really honored to do that. And for people who are curious, I bike to wherever the interview is. So it was quite a haul from the northwest side of Chicago down there. It was probably a 25-mile bike ride to get down there. But it was, really incredible and really beautiful story that his wife got him back into cycling. And when we closed our interview, he said that he knew that she was looking down on him and smiling and excited to see the interview. So it was really, I think, probably one of the most memorable and beautiful interviews I've ever done.
I think that is beautiful. And what a way for him to honor her memory, really, to be talking about something, that he mentions the first line is that she got him back into cycling in 2014. And then later on, he talks about if it wasn't for cycling, he probably wouldn't be here. He'd probably have some lifestyle health condition lifestyle related health condition that would have done him in. So, for him to do that interview and talk about it, I do think that's special.
Yeah. No, it's really like I'm honored to tell everyone's stories, but I think this one was really where I was like, I wanted to make sure that I felt like he was really happy with his story and he was really happy with his pictures. Generally, I don't let people like preview their photos, but I sent some to him and I wanted to make sure that like he liked him. And I really like, you'll notice with his shots, I'm actually a lot lower to the ground. So there's something you can do with camera work of like, if you're lower, someone is larger, kind of larger than life and more imposing. And I think that really felt like it fit him and his stature and his community. So it was really just beautiful, beautiful interview. And also just, he's kitted out in Chicago gear. That's something that people always comment on. I think he's wearing like 6 Chicago flags. And I think that was like, that's what I mean. There's things that don't fit into the written interview that you just see. And you can tell this is a man that loves his city. He's talking about biking. He talked about sweeping off glass off the trail. And even if that didn't make it to the written portion, you can like see it in how this man is dressed and the spot that he chose, that he really is deeply passionate about his community. I love that.
Well, I think your strategy of having them pick a spot. I mean, the background of this photo is, uh, a little bit talking about Major Taylor as a person,
Hmm.
and then a drawing of Major Taylor, and it just adds. So, I mean, it literally adds depth to this whole shot historically and visually and everything to have that in the background. What are some of the common themes that have come out as you've been talking to people?
Yeah, I think there's the positives and the negatives. And so I'll start with the positives. I think everyone I talk to realizes that biking is such a cool way to get to know a neighborhood. It is a very intimate means of transportation. You know, I remember explaining to a friend of mine who primarily drives about, how cyclists might run a red light. This is not something I do. I'm not going to comment on that, but I said that, well, the thing is, because he was like, well, how do aren't you scared? I was like, well, think like you're a pedestrian, and you creep out 6 inches and you can hear, right? You're connected to the pavement, like, especially if it's, if one lane of traffic is stopped, you're going to hear if there's cars coming, even a mile away, basically. And in a similar way, when people bike through neighborhoods in Chicago, you can like smell things. Like sometimes I'm like, should I stop? Like that smells really good. Like that is a good Indian place. I can tell. I'm I'm gonna have to come back here. And I think that's something that people mention is that like you see shops, you see people, particularly families. I had a mom I talked to who had similarly like a bucket style bike, and she mentioned that I think it was for Valentine's Day or for Halloween. Her kids sat in the bike and handed out to all the crossing guards. Like I think it was Valentine's. And that's just so cool. Like there have been many times that I'm biking in my neighborhood where I'll see someone else either on a bike or just walking, and they'll see me, I'll see them. And there's just this like intimacy that comes with that. Like it's really like you're speed walking, essentially. And I think that is so cool. And it makes you so connected to a city in a way that, I drive on occasion and you're kind of passing through. Like, even if you're stuck in traffic, you're still actively paying attention to the thing right in front of you. And you're quite alert biking, but especially if you're taking a more slow residential route, you kind of can breathe a little bit more and you can engage with the environment around you. Versus in driving, it's just, you're tunneled in. You're not going to hear just music outside as much. You're not going to smell stuff. So I think that's a big positive one. I think on the negative, it's safety. And I think that's something that, it breaks my heart that almost every person mentions, either feeling worried about something, or I've had several people talk to me who've had some sort of accident, whether it's during, whether it's someone harassing them. I had someone explain to me that I had to like ask them again to make sure that they're like, yeah, this guy like yelled at me for turning left. I was like, what? And it was like, yeah, because he had to like wait 10 seconds. So he got upset and tailed me and yelled at me and like told me some horrible things. So I think those are like the two big ones. Is like biking is really joyful, but also just the built environment and the culture really encourages these situations that are very dangerous. And even, I have a story that's like with a mom who like she had to leave the bike lane because it was flooded and a guy like closed past her and like retaliated at her. So I think that's kind of the dual dichotomies, is that people have this deep positivity and this deep sorrow, I think, with the state of biking in Chicago.
Chicago is a huge city, and how do you feel it's going? Do you think that there's a commitment to improving infrastructure? Is it stagnant? How do you see that?
It is complicated. So I think it is in any place. I think one of the biggest challenges with a lot of cities, I have watched some content about Philadelphia, and I can see they have similar issues, is Chicago has wards, which Chicago is divided into 50 wards, and they're essentially, to some degree, little fiefdoms, where the aldermen get to make certain low-level decisions about that community. And the alderman is like the smallest level of representative, and they serve on city council. So, for example, if you wanted to build a new building and you need a zoning change, it goes through your alderman. And so the alderman kind of is meant to speak for the community. But what that also means is that if you wanted a bike lane on a street, the person making that decision is the alderman. So it's very fragmented, and the level of bike infrastructure is really variable in the city. So like I'm lucky to be in a part of, Chicago where there's a lot of bike infrastructure, and it's kind of this virtuous cycle where there's a lot of bike infrastructure. So there's a lot of people asking for bike infrastructure. So the alderman's like dialed in and there's more. Versus there's parts of the South Side where I've heard aldermen say, yeah, well, no one bikes in my community. So like, why would I build that here? Who is that for? And I'm like, I know people bike in your community. I've biked in your community. I see people out there. They're just off down the sidewalk because you didn't build anything for them. So it's improving. And I think, it's gotten better and better over time. I think there's kind of a growing coalition. I think there's a lot of big activist groups that are helping raise visibility. But also, frankly, just there's a combination of things of like driving is getting more and more expensive. It's never cheap to own a car in a major metro, but it's not getting cheaper. And also our public transit system is unfortunately really deteriorated. So there's a lot of people I know who used to rely on the CTA, and now it's just like, well, there's all these delays, or it's not coming as frequently, and they pick up biking. And they're like, you know what? Why would I take 2 buses? It'll take me 40 minutes, and it could take longer, or I can bike, and it's 20 minutes. So I think, it's getting better. I think there's still a lot of work to do. And I think the biggest thing I would say is it's really, unfortunately, like a lot of things in Chicago, a very segregated experience. And I think a lot of the people I talk to experience that, is they're like, I've lived on the north side, I've lived on the south side, really different biking experiences. And I think that's something that's really challenging and that I grapple with both in my coverage and also just as I'm getting to interviews. It's like there's just can be very dramatic shifts in the level of investment that's put into biking and bike infrastructure.
I'm just so curious to see places like Chicago, in 10 years from now, what it will look like if cyclists have been hurt because you mentioned something there. And I think the truth of the matter is you don't know how much it'll get used until it's built. You know,
Yeah,
you just can't say, I don't have anybody here biking when it's not safe for them to go out and try to bike. So I'm really, again, 10 years from now to see Chicago and the changes is going to be really interesting.
absolutely. Well, and I think I'll say too, one thing that a few of my interviews have mentioned is I think Divvy, like bike share, has really helped because bike share is in every community. And so I think there's a natural like, oh, well, if there's a bike share station there, then we should probably have a bike lane. But also, I think some businesses are starting to see it too. There's a lot of great bike events now where it's like there's like a bike event called Sweet Roll that is just they go to pastry shops. And I think when a small business sees that and they're like, oh, bikers are also people and they also have money to spend and I can accommodate them or I cannot, then I think that can help change perspective and be like, this is a nuisance. This is an opportunity for me of like, there's the 606 trail in Chicago. And that's like a rails to trails conversion where it's like an elevated bike trail. And every single stop along that trail, you know, more and more businesses are opening up, rents are going up, pro and con, as those neighborhoods suddenly see more investment and more opportunity because suddenly there's all these people who are biking there, they're tourists or whatever they might be. And they're like, oh, well, where can I get some food? Where can I get some coffee? So I think people are it's starting to click in their minds that it's not just like building something and that's it. This is like an opportunity. And I'm hoping that starts to catch on.
Nice. I'm wondering about community engagement. Have any organizations reached out to you, or do you find organizations really receptive to the project? How does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've done a few kind of collaborations with like local bike shops. I've done some interviews at Working Bikes, which is a great local bike shop in Chicago. I did an interview and then kind of sponsored project with Igor Does My Bike, who's like a local bike shop. And then I've also worked with Femmes and Thems, which is a great woman and non-binary folks ride. And I worked to interview some of their riders. So I think people are really receptive. I think from what I've seen, the community reaction is really positive. I think the challenge is that the work that I do really lends itself to being scheduled out in a specific spot that someone chose. And so I found that with those group rides, it's like, oh, well, I can talk to like four people at the end, but then all their photos are clustered and it's like maybe not in their community. And similarly with like going to Working Bikes, I had like, I think 3 interviews that came out of that. And the interviews were really cool, but I felt like something was missing where I was like, even if they really like this bike shop, this probably isn't like the default spot that they maybe would have chosen. So I think it's challenging where I want to work more with folks, but I think it might be more a mutual promotion kind of thing. If like I promote their work, they promote my work, then it would be like me going and doing interviews there just because of how I want to do that work, if that makes sense.
Well, I think that does make sense. And again, it's kind of part of the storytelling gets changed when you're forced into an environment rather
Mhm.
than let them choose. What hope would you have for impacting cycling culture with this project?
Yeah, I mean, I think my biggest dream is like, you know, there's some very bike friendly aldermen in Chicago, and I hope maybe one day if someone says something ridiculous in city council, they'll go, well, you could check out this project. There's all sorts of people who bike Chicago, and I promise there's some landmarks you'll recognize in your neighborhood. So I don't know if that will actually happen, but I know that some aldermen have seen my work and some other people in city government. So like the Chicago Department of Transportation, folks like that. So my hope would be that people look at my work and challenge their own expectations when they're planning projects or streetscapes or things like that and think, okay, like, is this really safe for all of these road users? Right? Because I think if you really thought through some of these new road designs and you said, okay, what was it say for this dad and his 2 kids in a bunch bike? You go, they're in a door zone and there's no protection. Maybe I wouldn't put a 5-year-old there. And I would hope that maybe that lends itself to a bit of improvement. And yeah, and getting more people out on bikes. I think every single person, I always leave room for an interviewee to tell me like anything else, anything you feel like we didn't cover. And almost every single person is like, just get out there. get on your bike, try it. Like, here's how you can try it. Start with a park, like start slow. And, if I got 10 more people on bikes and I got one person to reconsider a street design, I think that would be a legacy enough.
Do you know if Mayor Brandon Johnson is a cyclist by any chance?
So he did, I think he is. I don't know to what extent. So he's done a photo. I don't want to be rude, but he did a photo op, I guess I would say, where he was biking a bike lane, bike to City Hall. He did do Bike the Drive and had some photos on Instagram. So I would say I know that he bikes. And from photos, bikers picked up on the fact that he knew where to position himself in the bike lane, like away from the door zone. So I take it he bikes. I have a feeling the mayor of Chicago probably doesn't bike a lot, simply if not for any other reason than just the security concerns. And I would completely respect that. I would not want to be mayor of Chicago and be vulnerable in that way, frankly. So I know that he bikes sometimes, but I don't know the extent.
Well, maybe you need to reach out and feature him as a Chicagoan who bikes.
Yeah, that would be one heck of an interview. I'll
Yeah.
say that. That would be a very cool opportunity. And I would also say, and that's something I've thought about, is how do I handle if a politician wanted to speak to me? I think I would ask some very different questions, frankly, because I think that's my responsibility. If I got that opportunity to, I would ask a little more challenging questions than I would ask your average person, let me say.
I like it. What about future plans? What do you see coming along down the road?
Yeah, I think the big one is I've started doing more video work. So I've gotten into videography. And the real reason for that is my goal is to capture and communicate what it is like biking Chicago. And I think it started with just a photo and a written interview. And then this amazing woman, Molly Fleck, who's a big bike advocate, said, I really wish I could hear these stories in people's own words. You should like do video. I was like, yeah, sure. Like I have a camera. I asked a friend, like, how hard it would be to get some audio stuff. Started doing that and featuring some of the clips of people's most impactful kind of sentences. And then what I'm really trying to do now is I want to do rolling interviews, which is something I've seen other folks do in other cities, where I'm following someone and we chat for a little bit while they're biking. Because I think if you haven't biked, there are still certain abstractions that you might not understand. Like I had a coworker ask me recently, like, I said something like, oh, paint isn't protection, which is kind of a pretty common slogan in the bike community. And she's like, what? Like, why does it have to be a protected bike lane? And I had to pause. I had to take a breath. And I was like, well, because intentionally or accidentally, someone could get into the bike lane. Like someone could be looking at their phone, turn the wheel wrong and hit a kid. So like that shouldn't be acceptable. So I think video is really the next step there. And I've done a few. I think I've published 2 rolling interview portions so far. And I think I have a third one in the books. And the reaction has been really positive because I think there's this visceral nature to seeing the differences in infrastructure as they're going and letting people comment on them. I think that's the next thing is I'm trying to dial that in and really figure out from a technical perspective how I can get that footage in a safe manner.
Would you ever consider doing an event at a gallery?
I would love to do an event at a gallery. At some point, I have 60 interviews now. I was definitely thinking at some point, I was like, should I do like a book or something? But I think that would be super fun. I think the interesting thing is that normally with photography, I feel like it's just the photo and there's like a little description. I think for me, I'd have to work with an event space and be like, no. Like the text has to be like readable because it isn't just one or the other. It's like really like, it's their story and the photo is a part of that story. But I would love to do that. So if that opportunity ever came up, I would seize it no matter what.
That would be fantastic. What advice would you have for aspiring creators?
I think the main one is, have a vision and figure out like what are the things that you won't compromise on, right? What do you want to do? Because you have to have a central core of what you're trying to achieve, because otherwise it floats around too much, right? So for me, it was you have to live in Chicago and you have to bike for travel. And I've turned down some people who are really great, even bike advocates, and I've said, I'm sorry, like I don't feel like that's true to what I'm trying to do. Because to me, part of what makes my project special is that every single person you see, if they're disappointed in the city, and they pay city taxes, they voted for mayor, they voted for alderman, and they're let down. So find that central core of what is it that you want to do, really stick to that, and then start small and simple and see what works, what you can do, what's practical. Like nice gear can help, but it's really your craft and the storytelling that will propel you forward. Like I really feel like, I got a nice camera for this project. I'm really proud of the photography. I don't think that if someone had recreated this and done it just with an iPhone, but had the same level of listening to people and really capture those stories, I think it would do equally as well. Maybe it wouldn't look as fancy, but I think people would still connect with that. So I'd encourage people, before you spend a bunch of money on gear, just start and see, like, is it resonating with people? Are you doing something that people see and they feel something with? And stick to your core principles, like really like draw a line somewhere, whatever that line is, and figure out like, this is what I'm trying to do. Really stick to it.
Wrap up here. Can you go through the different ways that people can follow the project?
Absolutely. So we're Chicagoans Who Bike, and we are on all the social media, or maybe not all of them these days, but most of them. So I think we're on Twitter/X, Instagram, Threads at Chai Who Bike. That's CHIWHOBIKE. And then we also just started a YouTube channel. So we're publishing longer form interviews there. So like full 10-minute conversations. That's the same handle, just Chicagoans Who Bike or Chai Who Bike. And then if you are not social media interested, you can just follow along on our website. We'll always publish it the same day. And that's just CHIWHO.bike, chaiwho.bike.
Viktor, it has been so fun having this conversation. I'm so glad that I ran across the website and that you agreed to come on. Like I said earlier, I think creativity is massively important, and there's so much creativity going on here as we've talked about. And thank you so much for taking the time to get us a little bit of a picture behind the scenes.
Absolutely, Tom. And thank you so much for having me. I love what you do.
And I'll look forward to more stuff coming out. I'll be keeping an eye on it, and maybe someday letting you know that I'm on my way to Bike the Drive, which would be awesome.
Absolutely. If you are in Chicago, I will absolutely make sure to give you a personal tour.
Fantastic. Take care and talk to you later.
Take care, Tom.
This is the second conversation I've had with someone about cycling in Chicago. Both times I found myself wanting to experience the Windy City on a bike. I don't know why I'm more interested in biking in Chicago than other big cities like LA or New York. For some reason, it seems more accessible to me. I have to say the profiles of people that Viktor captured adds to my interest in the cycling scene in Chicago. Maybe down the road I will find myself experiencing Bike the Drive and the Lake Michigan shore. In the past, there have been up to 20,000 riders that roll down Lakeshore Drive together. I will post a link in the show notes to photos of Bike the Drive. Doesn't look like 2024 photos are up yet, but I sure find previous years intriguing. I also really like the fact that the proceeds from the ride benefit the Active Transportation Alliance. I hope that you are finding some great rides to get in as fall starts to set in here in North America. And I also hope that you are beginning to think about some adventures that you will have in the future. And remember, age is just a gear change.